Ian, thanks for joining M10X, and great seeing you again. Let's start off with an introduction.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate being included, and it's extremely exciting for this topic. So, Ian Cronin, I help lead the World Economic Forum's work on advanced manufacturing and supply chains. In particular, how we can work with great leaders from chief operating, chief supply chain, chief procurement officers to really look at what are the big challenges facing production ecosystems, everybody involved in them, all the workers in there, and how we can try to address some of the challenges that we're all facing.
Awesome. Now, obviously, last time we met was actually in Davos at the World Economic Forum. From a supply chain perspective, what were some of the key takeaways?
Supply chains were front and center, as I think they have been, fortunately, and I think for all those involved in the world, rightfully so, for the last probably 3-4 years now. But again, right back in it, I think everyone is seeing the connections that it's not just about managing my supply, it's about the full ecosystem of trying to accomplish how do I become more resilient, the role in resilience, how do I become more sustainable, how do I drive my business? And so looking across all of these three facets, every single element of it was present in conversations, whether people were talking about net zero, whether people were talking about how do we manage and work with some of these geopolitical tensions, these trade realignments. The world is a complicated place right now, and how is that going to impact our supply chain? So the topic was everywhere for sure, and I think the question everyone in operations always thinks about is, okay, the thing that matters then is how, across all of those topics, how do we address them?
No, awesome. And also the World Economic Forum recently published sort of what are the big topics for 2024. Supply chain was, definitely right there in terms of digitization of supply chains, AI in supply chains. You already talked about resilient supply chains. Can you talk a little bit more about those big topics?
Yeah, I mean, they're all interrelated. I think that's the piece that we learned. I think the biggest aspect that we sort of continued to talk about was very fortunate to have quite a few leaders in operations and supply chain and procurement. And I think technology is always central as sort of an interconnecting piece of what's going to be the role of technology in addressing these challenges, but making sure that that's not kept within sort of a small group. So I think the big topic when we talked about technology, when we talked about supply chains and all of these other areas, is we're seeing large companies, innovative companies making this shift, adopting them, thinking about how they can leverage the technologies to make them more sustainable, to make them more resilient. But at the end of the day, it is an ecosystem. We're only as resilient as the weakest link in our supply chain. And so we can't just think we're going to make ourselves better, we're going to continue to grow, and expect that if everybody else in our supply chain doesn't have that same mentality, that we're going to be effective in our main objective there. And so one of the big topics of conversation was, yes, we need to continue to develop. We need to think about AI and generative AI and the industrial metaverse and all the different elements that are really going to shape where the management of operations supply chains go. But we have to bring everybody along on that journey. And so how do we make sure that we're making those learnings available, that we're actually supporting suppliers and those who are maybe don't have the understanding of which technologies they should look at. They don't necessarily have the capacity to run new pilots. They don't necessarily have the financing to say, how do I make these CapEx investments in my operations? And so that was a big source of conversation, particularly on, we can't think about this within our own four walls, but we have to think about this as partnerships.
100%. What I also liked is that the World Economic Forum did a big study that sort of put people front and center, right? So there's one thing to talk about technology, but then obviously, what is the impact on actually people that have to work with the technology or, are being impacted by technology. Can you talk a little bit more about that study, and then specifically about adopting new technology and the people side of that? And then second is, there is a challenge when it comes to global workforce in terms of re-education, new skills. The global workforce is aging. What are some of the insights of that study?
Yeah, I mean, so look, people have to be at the center of what we're talking about. And I think I was almost reticent to say that sentence, because if I go back 5 or 6 years to some of the conversations we were having globally, I think there was a conversation where we said, well, it's a human-centric fourth industrial revolution. And I felt at the moment when that was being said 5, 6 years ago, it was a hope. We hope people are at the center of this, but we're not really sure if that's going to happen, if it's going to materialize. And what is really exciting now is, as I mentioned before, the how of that. I think people have very concrete ideas of what does it mean to actually keep people at the center of this. And we see leaders who are making those steps. And so, I mean, to your point, if we look sort of historically in operating environments in companies, in corporate environments, I think there's always been a very good roadmap in most environments for if I come in and I start my job, how do I progress here? How do I grow it within my role? And where can that take me within my organization? That's not always been the same in operations for operators on factory floors with the people sort of driving this and having that same sort of understanding of where we can go. And so I think there's a couple elements that we sort of learned is one, there are leaders who are in industry who are helping their manufacturers, their operators, understand what is that roadmap for them. If I do training X, where does that take me? If I do training Y, what are my opportunities there? And so it creates also some excitement, some incentives for the individuals in those roles to sort of see where they can go, where they can progress. And I think probably the biggest thing that we also learned is at the center of this whole conversation is people and technology and how we drive that effectively together. And from our study, we found time and time again that efficient digital transformation has to involve conversations from the beginning with factory workers. Almost a perfect recipe for disaster is companies who just come in, decide what it's going to be, and implement it without ever talking to the operators. And I think that when you begin those conversations early with the folks, they see the ROI, they see people actively engage in this transformation process. But at the same time, it is a transformation. And so the other piece we learned is it's human nature, change is difficult for us. And so how do you manage that? And one of there's a few different aspects that came out of that. One is sort of expectation management. I think all of us, that can apply to anything we're doing. But do people understand the timelines of the transformation? When you say we're going to make this change, okay, by when? How fast do I have to do these things? That understanding from the beginning is incredibly helpful. The other piece is that not everybody learns in the same way. Do you have capacity to train in different ways? Because just because someone doesn't learn in one way doesn't mean they can't be just as effective as everybody else with that new technology if they're given different resources to learn. I think the third aspect that we really looked at in that particular study was that you will have champions, or we call them sort of super users with these new technologies. People who just get really excited, they gravitate towards it and they love it. There's sort of a dual benefit to that. If you can leverage those people, one, they feel more valued. They feel like they're actually helping to drive the transformation the company is aiming for and contributing in a new and different way. And then you're also able to have people who understand the role who are also helping to train others. And so you create a bit of a feedback loop. And so I think all of these things come together to really help enable the change on the factory floor. And sort of the last piece to a lot of what came out of that study was this notion that it's iterative. You can't say, okay, well, we did the training, now we're sort of ready to go. So you have to be prepared to have this, and I mean, we generally talk about lifelong learning, and that's something that's going to enable workers to continue to progress. But that even in implementation of a new technology. And so do you have the right incentives in place? And do you have a process that's iterative to help people continue to understand? And so I think that was some of the big things from that particular report that we found. And now it's, how do you take that forward? With that, we were in factory floors talking with operators around the world to understand their experience with this transformation. And that needs to happen. That needs to continue to happen. So we're excited for where that's going also.
Excellent. Now, the other sort of key discussion topic at Davos was how supply chain and sustainability are being super connected. Mm-hmm. What is your advice, or what are some of the thoughts that you can share with chief supply chain officers on how to think about those two in a much more connected fashion?
Partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. I think we were looking at sort of the big enablers of, I mean, for us, the elephant in the room for everybody, which is Scope 3 emissions. It depends on the industry sector, but it can range in some industries 50%, but in most it's 70 to 95% of their total carbon footprint is from Scope 3. So the emissions from the rest of their supply chain outside of their direct control. And the only way that you can do that is with partnerships. Now, that is sort of a very common trend, and talking with leaders of operations and supply chains, that I'm certainly not the first person to ever say that out loud, and I think there's almost some frustration among our partners where they say, I need to address Scope 3 emissions. My CEO has made a commitment that we're going to be net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever the marker is. I have no idea how to get there, and your advice to me is that I need to partner with other people. I need to collaborate with my supply chain partners. Thank you, I know that, but to do what? How? And so I think one of the things that we put out a couple different frameworks in the last year and a half, particularly around net zero. So one was a no excuse framework to net zero that really outlined, if you're thinking about making a commitment, if you have it, you need to execute across these 10 pillars in order to achieve net zero in general. And now we're looking at sort of deep dives into some of those pillars. One of them is particularly on scope 3, and really the idea there is we need tangible examples. So we've built a use case repository of people who have actually moved the dial on reducing their scope 3 emissions, and then pulling out the learnings. What were the commonalities? What did they all do that was similar? There's not a panacea to solving this, but I think it's one of those things where the more examples people have of what is a partnership, what is collaboration, is key. So sustainability and supply chains, it's critical. I think it's becoming ingrained in the business model of most companies. I think when you think about, even if it's on technology or if it's on sustainability, there was a propensity not that long ago, you could go back 10 years to sort of say, I'm going to wait and sort of see what my competitors are doing on this. And if they're adopting a new technology, if they're sort of thinking about sustainability in a different way, I'll consider sort of what that means for me. And I think what we're seeing is some companies shifting and some companies needing to shift faster to being proactive on that. Because if you wait, you might not be around in 5 years to catch up. And so I think those are some of the big things that we've talked about. Is there's consumer demand. People want to be more sustainable. There's regulatory demand that's coming in this space. And then there's so many opportunities, and again, not the first person to say this, but some win-wins on how you actually can drive the competitiveness of your organization and become more sustainable. And so if we can bring these together, we can actually move the dial on this. With all of that said, I think we found that something like 50% of the companies who had made a scope 3 commitment are falling off track of that commitment. So there's a lot of opportunity, but we're not moving quick enough. And part of that is, I think, seeing the ecosystem is that there isn't sort of that true understanding of what's the business sense, that collaboration with the supply chain partner. It exists, but I think we need to do a better story and people involved in sort of sharing some of the industry knowledge of helping that narrative become more clear.
Well, makes total sense. Now, actually, the other thing, and to maybe build on this, is policymakers and government bodies. They were also, present in Davos, and I think they play a critical role in, collaborating with enterprises to get to more, responsible, sustainable supply chains. How can we accelerate that level of collaboration, and what's your point of view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dialogues in a place like our annual meeting in Davos or wherever they're happening is sort of the first step. I think I'm always shocked when I hear from policymakers. Like, policymakers are hungry for insight, for input from industry. I think there's people in general, we can be skeptical of policy design but I think with the full benefit of the doubt, policies are made with the absolute best intentions. Sometimes they just don't work in the real world the way we anticipate. And so we need conversation to have that feedback loop to say, look, here's what's working and here's what's not working. Here's the direction we see as industry leaders, things going, whether it's from supply chain disruptions or new models of whether it's regional production capability, it's a spread between cost competitiveness and risk competitiveness and the models companies are thinking about. And how does the current policy operating environment impact that? And how does it need to change for us all to be more effective? So that conversation has to start, but there's also some very concrete and tangible things that I think, one, are happening from a policy perspective to help this, and that can. I mean, we were talking about technology adoption earlier, particularly with small and medium-sized enterprises. Again, in a moment of uncertainty is usually not when people make large CapEx investments. And at the same time, if we go back to the pandemic, we saw the companies that had made those investments, that had invested in advanced technology solutions in their supply chains and in their operations, fared much better through the pandemic than those who hadn't. And so how do we help them to make those types of investments? And I think policymakers, play an enormous role in helping to come in to create incentives and to de-risk some of those investments, even when there are moments of uncertainty, because they will provide dividends in resilience that's going to help economies and help sort of the entire ecosystem flourish. So there's a lot to be done there, but I think that we're having the right conversations now. I think the other thing I would encourage everybody is, we were talking with some policymakers to say, look, we put out, when we were thinking about a policy, we put out a call for comments, but I hear from the same 5 companies every time. And so we need more people to be engaging with us in that conversation when we put out official calls for comment. So I think there's the conversations that can happen, but then there's also sort of this direct engagement, and it doesn't always have to be this, well, I'm lobbying for my position. It can be much more, here's what we're seeing, and we see it's going to be better if it's like this, and policymakers are looking for that type of insight.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thanks for sharing that. I want to shift the conversation to the lighthouses. First Monday, the World Economic Forum in Davos, a lot of lighthouses were announced. Tell us a little bit more about, what are those?
Yeah, so the Global Lighthouse Network was an initiative that we launched probably almost 5 years ago now. It was originally a research piece of work where we were just looking at what happens when companies try to implement new technologies in their operations and supply chains. And in that initial piece, we found that 70 to 75% of companies, when they go through this effort, get stuck in pilot phase. They never reach scale, they never get an ROI. So we said, well, 25 to 30% do. What if we could identify the 1% who are the very best at this, who have multiple integrated use cases? And since then, we've been in an effort to identify these factories, and I think it's important. A company is not a lighthouse. A site, or perhaps a particular element of their supply chain, is a lighthouse. We're looking from an end-to-end perspective. But the real goal is that we can, yes, recognize these folks as sort of leaders. There's an award, there's a recognition. But equally important, or actually I would say far more important, is that every single one of them agrees to go on a learning journey to share with the community what they've done and how they've done it. So
amazing.
We now have 153 lighthouses. There's 17 sustainability lighthouses. And every month we are in one of these, either virtually or in person, doing what we call a go and see with the community, with the lighthouse community, to talk with the people who drove the digital transformation, to see these use cases, and to really understand sort of what's happening in that environment. And I think it's built on the premise, and I think often people are surprised when these lighthouses are willing to have other people come in. And it comes sort of there's sort of 2 elements to it. One is, anyone who has sort of gone through this type of digital transformation in their operations knows how difficult it was to do that. So just because I come in and see what you did doesn't mean I can go in and do the exact same thing myself. But it doesn't mean I can't be inspired by what you've done and learn from the lessons. And this notion of sort of the rising tide floats all ships, which is very fitting given what's in the background here, I think is really central to this entire network and what we're trying to do. I mean, it's also, what was a lighthouse last year is not a lighthouse this year. And so we need to have this continuous idea of what is the best of what's possible right now. I think if we think about something like artificial intelligence, in the early cohorts, I would say only about 10% of the applications we received had a artificial intelligence-based use case as part of their submission. Now it's at 60%.
Oh, wow.
In the latest cohort of 21 new lighthouses that we just announced in December, every single one of them had a generative AI pilot already running in their lighthouse facility. So it wasn't one of their core use cases, but they're already working on this. And so I think it's that sort of not resting on what I've done, but also thinking about what's coming is really also central to the community.
Interesting. What were some of the lighthouses that were announced in Davos that stood out to you, and why?
Well, I mean, there was 21 of them, and I think they all stood out. We had a fantastic meeting to sort of hand out the awards for the latest lighthouses and to sort of talk about what's needed. And the thing that stood out to me the most was actually going back to a comment that we were discussing earlier, which was on the need to sort of not keep this just within those who are high performing. I think there was clear recognition that, look, if you're a small or medium-sized company and maybe you're a supplier to one of these large players, and you see that these large multinational conglomerates, whether it's Schneider Electric or Unilever, or Johnson & Johnson, and there's many others, have a lighthouse. Sometimes the thought can be, well, yeah, of course they can do that. I don't have the same resources. I don't have thousands of workers across multiple continents. And so I think there's the danger of us sort of losing that attention, saying, well, I have to go back to sort of what I'm doing. And there was a recognition, but that doesn't mean these learnings aren't applicable, that we can't cross-pollinate here across different communities. We have small and medium-sized companies who are lighthouses in the community already. And so the big conversation from that group being, how do we ensure that we don't sort of create an industrial digital divide that keeps growing, where the lighthouses continue to excel up here and everybody else sort of gets left behind? And so I was really excited and inspired to sort of hear from the group of saying, okay, it's great that we're here, we're talking with each other, but we need to make sure this message reaches everybody, and not just that we're explaining the message, but that we're actively and proactively helping people to go on this journey with us. And so to me, out of all the lighthouses we talked about sort of the AI applications. I think there's amazing things. This renewed focus on sustainability, another sort of major piece. But this idea of genuinely the recognition of needing to share beyond and continue to not think about my four walls only was really exciting for me.
I love that, and thanks for sharing that. Now, many companies, dialing in today might be like, hey, how do I get a lighthouse? Or at least, what is the process?
Yeah, so it begins with, we do 2 waves each year of sort of applications. So there's an online application. If someone types in World Economic Forum lighthouses, that you can find the website, and there's an application page there. Phase 1 of the application is an online submission of, you have to submit 5 use cases of what you're doing, how you're actually looking at sort of integrated applications of new technologies. The focus is really that it's quantitative impact, though. So if I build a brand new facility and it goes live tomorrow, I can't submit tomorrow to be a lighthouse. I have to have 9 to 12 months of demonstratable, quantifiable impact of what is actually happening in that space before I can be considered as a lighthouse. So I think the other exciting thing is we have sort of greenfield sites, but we have facilities that are lighthouses that are more than a century old, that have been refitted with new technologies. A lot of the amazing things that 09 produces, you'll find in these locations. And so I think that's a really exciting element. So we have that initial sort of virtual submission. Those get evaluated by a team, and then for those that sort of make it to phase 2 based on that initial submission, we go visit them. Anyone who's sort of been involved in digital transformation factories, sometimes you have to see it. Let me go see what it looks, what's actually happening on the ground, to talk to the people who were involved with that. And then following the actual visits, we have an expert panel that is external to the World Economic Forum that we bring together twice a year, who looks at all of the submissions and considers it's a mix of industry leaders and academics, about 70% from industry and 30% from academia, who look at these and say, okay, is this really the most cutting edge that's possible right now? And taking into account the industry that they're in and all these different elements. And then from that final review panel, we find out who the lighthouses are, and it's always really exciting to then go on the journey with them of integrating them into the community and being able to sort of share all the things that they've done.
I really love that initiative, and I think it's a great way to share learnings, best practices, knowledge with everyone that's part of the community. So, really cool. Last question. A lot of those lighthouses are sort of next-gen manufacturing, but you also mentioned there are what you call end-to-end lighthouses. What is an end-to-end lighthouse? And again, what are some that excited you?
I mean, it goes back to that idea of what we were talking about of true sort of ecosystem design, where we have some end-to-end lighthouses from Johnson & Johnson and others who are really saying, okay, what have you done to use technology to interconnect the different pieces on it to drive a specific outcome? And so some of those have demonstrated that, before they had the ability to digitally connect across their supply chain and an element of their value chain, they knew that they had certain metrics of operational efficiency, certain losses along the way, and then blind spots. And by building this end-to-end digital connection, they were able to remove those. They were able to operationally identify areas where they didn't even know that they were losing money or losing time or causing negative sustainability impacts. And through that, they were able to highlight all of that and then address it is the sort of big piece on that. So again, visibility is really sort of critical to that, but then it's what do you do with the information? I mean, we're in an age we're inundated with data and information, and if it's not actionable, it's not useful. And so I think those are the big things that the end-to-end lighthouses really try to focus on, of how do we connect these pieces to accomplish whether it's a sustainability goal, a resilience goal, a business performance goal, or all of the above. And so those are really critical. And I think we've talked with some of the leaders in the supply chains, and it was amazing to see the transition and the lessons really were learned in the last 4 years. It's easy to say we learned a lot during the pandemic or during our response to the supply chain disruptions with the war in Ukraine. But to actually see people sort of have concrete use cases. I mean, the recent disruptions we've seen in the Red Sea, talking with some of the leaders, they said, well, actually, it cost us money. We've had to change the direction of sort of where we've gone, but we were able to pivot so much faster than we were when the same sort of disruption started to happen with us in ports during the pandemic. And so it's not that disruptions aren't going to happen, but it's how quickly can you adapt to them? And I think that's where technology plays an enormous role, and where these sort of end-to-end lighthouses can really, hopefully, provide a sort of a source of inspiration for others.
Totally. No, awesome. And thanks, Ian, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge today.
Wisdom might be a bit grand, but happy to share some of the things I've seen others do.
Awesome. Thanks for being here with us today at Aim10X, and looking forward to our next interaction.
My pleasure. Thank you.